The safest way to raise your flowerhorn. Starting with obvious, a flowerhorn tank's gotta have plenty of filter media and scheduled water changes. The safest way to do water changes is by doing pretty big weekly water changes depending on your flowerhorn's size and the tank's size. Unless you live in a tropical area, matching the temperature of the new water during water changes is a good practice, and putting in a little more water conditioner is also a good idea. Flowerhorns eat a lot. They will eat just about any kind of food you give them. But just because they eat it, it doesn't always mean it's good for them. By far, the safest foods to feed are pellets and freeze-dried foods. The way pellets and freeze-dried foods are manufactured usually ensure safer feeding than other foods. One thing though, when feeding these foods, the safest way to feed are by using a plastic spoon, forceps, or just pouring some in straight out of the bottle and not using your hands. Then there are foods that could have some risk factors that could cause illness in your flowerhorn. First, let's talk about frozen foods. When feeding frozen foods, try not to just drop the frozen cube into the tank. For example, if you're gonna feed bloodworms, drop it into a cup of water and thaw it first. Stirring it will make it thaw faster. Then pour out the water and rinse it again until most of the bloodworm juice is gone. The reason for this is so that it doesn't foul the water. Another thing about frozen foods is that you should not refreeze already thawed food. Once you take it out of the packaging and thaw it, the bacteria growth is accelerated. To kill possible parasites, frozen foods need to be stored in -4 degrees Fahrenheit or -20 degrees Celsius or colder for 7 days. Most refrigerators don't get that cold, and freezing will not kill most bacteria. It'll only stop their growth until thawed. This is why frozen foods could be somewhat risky, but most of the time they're perfectly fine. Hikari frozen bloodworms, for example, are sterilized during manufacturing. My experience with frozen foods in general has been good. However, there was one time that a frozen food made all of my fish sick. It was a rare occasion, but it did happen out of the blue. And there are the live foods. Live foods like the feeder fish are actually very nutritious, especially when the whole fish is fed. But beside the controversial practice of feeding live fish, feeder fish could carry pathogens that could directly transfer to your flowerhorn. It could be internal parasites, external parasites like ick, or even other harmful disease. In my experience with live fish, most of the time everything was fine. A long time ago, I used to keep Oscars and I power fed them like goldfish once a month. The Oscars became huge really fast, but around the 7-month mark, the live feeders gave my Oscars internal parasites and a leech that was sucking blood from one of my Oscars' caudal fin. It's a similar story with feeder shrimp. I used to feed my flowerhorn feeder shrimp once a month. Everything was fine for over a year. Then one of the batch gave him internal parasites. In my opinion, any live creatures that live in the water are potentially the most hazardous to feed to your flowerhorn because they can transfer pathogens more directly. For live land creatures, it might be a little safer to a point. I will not feed anything wild caught to my flowerhorn. You might think, but wild predatory fish eat live fish or live bugs all the time. Yes, that's true, but those guys are the strongest of their species and probably have the immune system to deal with it. Our flowerhorns aren't built like them. Our flowerhorns are aquarium bred and raised and groomed. I feed my flowerhorn live mealworms. I got load of mealworms, wheat bran, and potato shavings. I've used live mealworms of different sizes in the past with Oscars, silver arana, discus, cichlids, and even a betta fish. I've never had any problems with mealworms, but I can't say that mealworms are 100% safe. Depending on how they were kept by the breeder and how they were kept at home, they could possibly carry something. So I can't say they are one of the foods that are the safest to feed, but the freeze-dried kind are fine if you're not comfortable with live mealworms. Earthworms are in the similar category with mealworms. I'll never feed wild-caught earthworms to my flowerhorn, but if you raise your own and gut load them with things like vegetables, they could make a very healthy meal for your flowerhorn. But again, depending on how they are raised, they might also carry something. So I also can't say earthworms are one of the safest foods to feed either. So basically, the safest foods to feed your flowerhorn are different kinds of high-protein pellets like Hikari Sickly Gold, Humpy Head, Ever Red, Okiko or Grand Sumo, and others. and freeze-dried foods like freeze-dried grasshoppers, freeze-dried krill, freeze-dried mealworms, or sun-dried anchovies, and others. The reason freeze-dried foods are safe is because they go through a manufacturing process that kills most pathogens, especially parasites. They are dried at super low temperatures and then dried again at around freezing temperature. Finally, a little note on sleep. Flowerhorns, like any living animal, needs a long good night's sleep each day. Usually, a complete darkness is the best. If your flowerhorn doesn't get enough sleep each day, or he or she could be less healthy and less colorful. So basically, the safest way to raise your flowerhorn is by feeding variety of pellets and freeze-dried foods. And make sure he or she gets a good night's sleep. Everything else is about taking a slight calculated risk, in my opinion.